Hello everyone. Today we'll be talking about how a negative team can utilize a different framework than the affirmative to win a debate round. First off, we'll talk about what framework is and why we use framework in Lincoln Douglas. And secondly, we'll talk about how a negative team can use a different framework than the affirmative to beat them, or use the same one and still beat them while running a different framework. So first off, let's talk about what framework is. Simply put, framework is how the people in the round should evaluate the debate. Specifically, and most important, is the judge. Because the judge has to render a decision, they have to figure out, okay, through what lens should I be using in order to pick out who wins and who loses the round. For Lincoln Douglas, we've sort of simplified it by creating a value and value criterion system. A value is, simply put, the most important thing you should be upholding within this debate round, i.e. morality and or justice, two of the most common values used in LD debate. And secondly, then how do we measure whether or not the affirmative or negative has met the burden of proving that their cases fall under the value of the round, right? Generally speaking, we usually have consequentialism as one of our main value criterions, especially in progressive LD debate. We also use something like Rawls' difference principle to use as a value criterion, as well as Kantian ethics. I don't include Kantian in this lecture because, one, I think focusing on Rawls and consequences within this lecture is going to be the best things to be for this one. So what are the advantages of having a different framework than the affirmative? Well, the first thing we'd like to talk about is having a topic that posits forth requiring you to run a different framework. Let's say we're using the NSDA topic. Utilizing framework with consequentialism on the neg when we're defending civil liberties is probably not the bestest idea, because public health crises generally result in body counts. And when we're talking about pure consequences, the civil liberties being declined generally does not outweigh when it comes to body counts that would be within consequences. So having a different one is generally advantageous in topics that require you to have a different value criterion and value than the AF. The second advantage, I think, is being able to utilize the value criterion of the AF as well as the value criterion of the negative, as long as they can both uphold the value of the debate. And if you can win on one of those points, you generally win if you can beat the affirmative case if they don't meet, or if they meet one of the values that you're going for. So what are then the disadvantage to this strategy? Well, the main disadvantage is you're going to have a lot of moving parts within this debate, and having a lot of moving parts can get sort of confusing if you're not used to it. And it can also get confusing for the judges who have you in the back if you don't make it clear the ifs and or whys of why you should win on one framework versus another framework, and why even if you lose one framework, you should still win on this different framework, right? This is a very judge-dependent tactic, and it's really, really, really important to be paying attention to judge body language as we're going forth and having these debates in front of our judges. Some judges, when they look confused, will give you nonverbal cues, and some judges will just be stoic. But those judges who are giving you nonverbal cues, if they get it, keep going. If they don't get it, then that takes away one of your strategies. But the good thing is you have another strategy you can utilize to do so. So let's talk about value and value criterions in this example. The first one I'll be talking about is having the value of justice as per the NSDA topic of public health emergencies justify limiting civil liberties. Because justice is already in the topic, it's probably the easiest one to use as a value, right? The simple definition that I have for justice in this example is being treated with respect. Respect is a loaded word that can mean a lot of things, i.e. we are given enough sustenance to be able to live without being in a disadvantaged situation, not destroying our human rights, right? And even being alive can all fall into what justice can be in this debate. So I think justice is a decent, if not really, really good value to be using under the NSDA topic. You can also use morality. They basically mean the same thing. It's just semantics, right? So the value criterion I will be using in this example for the affirmative is utilitarian calculus or consequentialism. What does that mean? Well, it's just a concept about like maximizing our expected well-being as what I have on this doc. That just means that the one that it can increase our livelihood the best as a human species should be the value criterion we should use. Generally speaking, that deals with body counts. Because if some say, I don't know, 100,000 people die compared to having some civil liberties be limited, it's always easier to look at that and be like, okay, yeah, I'd rather be alive than say not be able to live in the specific home that I'd like to go on because the state has decided it should be taken away from me, right? Another example of what utilitarian calculus or consequentialism can be is through pleasure and pain. I think this is the Moen evidence that everyone utilizes in debate. It just talks about like, look, if it hurts, it's probably not a good thing, so we should not be using it. And if it is good, we should be using it, i.e. if it saves us, we can feel pleasure from it, and if it kills us, then we can feel pain. Another justification as to why consequentialism is used in debate is this idea of that only the states can really utilize consequentialism because it is the only way they can decide any sort of decision, because they have to look at the pros and cons, i.e. The net benefits versus the risks of the decision they're about to make. Now, Rawls is a really, really, really decent way to take down consequentialism, because not only does it look through a sort of like consequentialist lens, but it creates analysis as to the general way that we view consequentialism in the status quo and why it cannot be utilized in debate. So then what does it mean to agree with utilitarian calculus? Well, we still agree that pleasure and pain is important and that we should maximize expected well-being. The question is the utilitarianism of the affirmative is it really maximizing well-being when we're using state actors to decide what we can and cannot do, right? And Rawls is really, really important because it creates a priority of who should be seen in society in order for the negative to win. So in this debate, Rawls would be using something called the difference principle that posits forth the most disadvantaged within society and gives you reasons as to why that's important. Well, one, because they're a good chunk of society, and two, it is the most fair because if the people with the least benefits can get something out of it, then it'll trickle up to the people on the top and they will also experience the same thing. Because generally speaking, what usually is good for like the top half may not be the best for the bottom half, i.e. some of the taxes that were cut during the Trump era didn't really benefit anyone in the consumer area, right? So then let's look at a simple case of the affirmative and the value criterion they can have, and then what the negative can do. So this is a simple AF under the NSDA topic, and it's probably one of the most common ones. This one only has two contentions. There are no cards. It's just a simple like summary of what it can be. So the value would be justice, the value criterion would be util or consequentialism, and the advantage / contention would be that public health emergencies kill people. There's a lot of statistics as to the death counts, as well as to the conditions that people who have had COVID deal with. We're in the millions now in the death counts, and we are in the however many more in the affected lives, i.e. post-COVID symptoms that we experience and the effects that they have towards those people when it comes to paying medical bills, to quality of life, etc. Right? That's a decent contention with impacts, and it creates a priority under consequentialism as to why we need to be paying attention to public health emergencies, right? Contention 2 grants us the effect to be able to say that's why it's okay to take away some rights for some if it preserves the lives and livelihood of the many, right? It's okay to have some lockdowns if it means that less people will die from COVID. And that's it, right? That's two simple contentions, very simple and very easy to run. Well, then what can the neg do? Well, the neg in this debate, and this is generally what the generic neg is, right, is the neg will also value justice, and will be using Rawls's difference principle to figure out why something is just or not, right? And they'll be using contention one, and only just generally one contention, sometimes two, but this one will have one because this is a framework heavy round. You generally only want to have one that meets your value criterion. So this contention talks about authoritarianism and why authoritarian governments will use public health emergencies to hurt their citizens. There are many pieces of evidence out there that talk about authoritarian regimes using public health crises and public health emergencies to power grab, right? And in that power grab, they will hurt the citizens who are within their country because they don't really care about them. They just care about maintaining power and utilizing that power to increase their hold on society. And so that can lead us to a bunch of different impacts under contention one. There is quite a few evidence of what authoritarian regimes can and cannot do. The first one is a reduction in human rights, right? There are examples in different countries about how freedom of the press goes away when public health emergency crises occur. There's also surveillance that can occur from it as they need to use the emergency to make sure everything is up and going, but at the same time, surveillance of the citizens occurs. There may even be silencing that occurs within authoritarian regimes, that if those people who speak up about public health crises that may go against what the government says will have those people be silenced. And another impact that can be utilized and should be utilized within authoritarianism is that authoritarian governments generally are the ones that go to war with each other, and that causes pain and suffering to the degree that it is scary. So why does this contention meet the negatives value criterion? Well, generally speaking, authoritarianisms, if you all have had some lessons on, say, Iraq, Saddam Hussein was not the best leader for his citizens. In fact, there have been mass sites and places of mass suffering for people who Saddam did not believe should be valued within society. And so that goes against the difference principle of valuing the people who are the most disadvantaged within society, right? So if authoritarianism goes up, the people who will be affected will be the people who are by POC or really, really poor, right? And that's generally a good chunk of the population. So if they are being hurt, then that means that the resolution cannot meet this, therefore the negative should win. So what are the ways a negative can win versus an affirmative when they have a different framework? Where the first one is to have indicts, right, to the idea of utilitarianism. They need to have indicts as to why utilitarianism is bad and why it should not be used to evaluate the round under the lens of justice. A few examples of utilitarian calculus, if we're going to be using states, is not every state uses utilitarian or consequentialism. Some of them use different forms to decide whether or not a government should or should not do something. I know Germany is more on the Kantian line when it comes to making some decisions in their government space and doesn't just utilize consequentialism. Secondly, Rawls makes an indite within their idea of what justice is, and that the way consequentialists use justice and utilitarianism is one that benefits the top rung of the ladder and only them. So it creates a skew where when we mean maximizing well-being, there's almost sort of like a parentheses for the few, right, in those parentheses. And having an impact as to why viewing the world through that lens is bad should gain you some offense versus the framework as to why the judge should not evaluate that framework. If you win that the framework of the affirmative is bad, you need to take a look as to the contentions and whether or not the public health crises will kill disproportionately, the lower class. Like, will it kill more of them, right? If the measures taken under the Contention 2 say that the people who have to work jobs can't actually quarantine, and it would actually hurt them, means that the affirmative cannot meet the framework of the negative, and in conjunction with Contention 1, if you win that authoritarianism actually hurts more people and hurts the lower end of society, then that is a justification as to why the affirmative should not win, because they don't meet their framework and you've won your framework and your contention as to why that it should outweigh under the difference principle. Now let's say you're losing the difference principle, and the affirmative has some really, really good justifications as to why consequentialism is good. What is the second way that you can use to win this round? Well, the first thing you need to be able to be ready to go for is say, even if I don't win my framework, that is not a reason to vote affirmative. My case can still fit under consequentialism, and I'll show you how. And you need to show them how, right? You need to tell the judge why authoritarianism is worse than the impacts of the first contention, right? If war under authoritarianism has a chance to go world war because there are quite a few powerful authoritarian governments, and if we were to use a public health emergency, it would give them justification to go to war with their enemies. Having a count of what that impact may look like versus the affirmative is a good way to see, the benefits of the affirmative versus the harms of the negative. If you have offensive or defensive arguments as to why Contention 2 does not actually work and actually makes things worse for people, i.e., mandatory restrictions of social distancing, masks, and quarantines actually don't decrease the amount of people who would be killed by COVID, that means that there is even less justification as to why, because those impacts of the affirmative sort of become non-unique, i.e., they will occur regardless of whether or not, right, the public health crisis puts in measures to limit civil liberties. Like if it means this amount of people will die regardless, then why would you add more body counts in order to, why would you add more body counts? That there would be literally no reason. So you can go with that strategy. Now, that being said, this is a hard strategy to pull off if you don't have a lot of experience using different frameworks versus an affirmative. But because this NSDA topic almost requires you sort of have to figure out, how does my case fit under the affirmative case, and why does the affirmative case not fit under my case or under my framework, and how do I win? And that has to be going out throughout the round, keeping a meticulous flow and keeping all your arguments in line and making smart decisions in the round will be the difference when whether or not the negative or the affirmative can win this round. Thank you, everyone, and have a nice day.